My name is Alex Smith. I'm 26 years old, and I grew up in a northern suburb of Atlanta, the kind of place with crisp white fences, lawns trimmed like putting greens, and backyard BBQs where the laughter was loud enough to bury any truth underneath the turf. My family, if you could even call it that, looked like something out of a holiday catalog. Dad was the CEO of Smith Tech, a medical device company. Mom was a former elementary school teacher adored by every church group she ever joined. And Brandon was the golden boy, varsity basketball captain, straight A student, prom king. He had everything I never did. I showed up in that picture like a misprint, dark hair, brown eyes, always standing just outside the circle of arms. I don't remember exactly when I realized I was different. Maybe it was when I turned 6 and Brandon smashed the model airplane Dad had given me for my birthday, then sneered, "This isn't for outsiders." Or maybe when I was 7 and a neighbor asked my mom, "Is he a relative's kid?" and she just smiled awkwardly and said nothing. Brandon didn't hit me much. He was smarter than that. He broke my stuff, pulled the batteries from my remotes, switched out my lunch, and spread rumors at school that I was the result of a mistake with the maid. I once overheard him whisper to his friends, "You know why his eyes are brown and everyone else's are blue? He's not one of us." I told Mom. She wouldn't meet my eyes and said, "Brandon's just kidding. Don't take it seriously." Dad was different. He didn't joke. He'd stare at me too long, like he was trying to find some trace of himself in me. Then he'd say the one thing he always did, "Learn to stay quiet. You'll have an easier life." So I did. I retreated into silence, into books, into my own world. While other kids got birthday parties with triple-layer cakes, I got a $25 gift card and a birthday email from Dad. By 12, the only adult who ever asked if I was okay was my music teacher. But I wasn't weak. I fought back quietly. I once wrote Brandon a long letter, listing every way he'd hurt me. I never gave it to him. I tucked it into a drawer, and every time he did something else, I added a new line. That letter grew over the years, thick and bitter, like a lump in my throat every time I had to call that man Dad. Mom, she was always the hardest to read. She never hugged me, but once, I saw her run her hand over a photo of me in the hallway, only to pull it back like she'd touched a flame. Another time, when Brandon shoved me down the stairs, she cleaned up my scrapes and whispered, "I'm sorry." And that was it. Silence for the rest of the week. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Until Christmas Eve, when I was 16. Brandon got a brand new Jeep Grand Cherokee. I got a t-shirt with the Smith Tech logo on it, the kind they give employees after their 90-day review. Brandon laughed, holding it up like a trophy. Awesome. The company gives out rewards for sponsored kids now. Huh. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. Then I stood up, placed the shirt back in the box, and said, "Thanks. I was actually planning to wear this when I applied somewhere else." Dad squinted. Mom turned her face away. Later that night, I went downstairs to get some milk. The living room light was still on. My parents sat on the couch, unaware I was standing halfway down the stairs. I heard Mom say, "Don't you feel guilty? That boy doesn't deserve this." Dad replied, "I did the best I could. I can't erase the past. We owe him the truth. There'll be a time for that." I froze, the milk glass trembling in my hand. I didn't know who I was anymore, but I knew one thing for sure. This family was hiding something, and I was right at the center of it. I'll never forget that night, my 18th birthday. It was the first time I ever planned to invite Emily, my classmate from AP Literature, over to my house. Emily was different. She didn't care that my last name was Smith, or that my parents never mentioned me in their picture-perfect Facebook posts. She once told me during tutoring, "Alex, you've got the eyes of someone who's always thinking about a place he doesn't belong to." But I liked that silence. I had everything set. I cleaned out the garage, hung string lights, and queued up an indie playlist we both loved. But the moment Emily stepped through the door, I knew I'd made a mistake, not because she didn't smile, but because Brandon noticed her way too early. He threw an arm around me, something he'd never done before, and said just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, wow. Emily, you're not afraid of catching something weird hanging out with Alex, I mean. Who even knows who his real parents are?" Right, laughter exploded like fireworks in that damn basement. Emily froze. I stood there, paralyzed. But Brandon didn't stop. He turned to his buddies, raised his beer, and said, "Here's to our little birthday boy." The adopted one. Cheers erupted. I wanted to punch him. God, I should have. But I did something worse. I said nothing. Emily leaned in and whispered, "I'm sorry," and left. I followed her. But just as I reached the front door, my mom stepped in my way. She didn't look angry. She looked regretful. She took my hand, squeezed it tight, and in her eyes I saw an old, familiar kind of fear. "Alex," she said softly, "don't let him hurt you. I know you're not what he says you are." I pulled my hand away, said nothing. Because at that moment, something worse than humiliation took root inside me, doubt. What if Brandon was right? What if I really didn't belong here? Not even a little. I drove around the neighborhood for almost an hour. Eventually, I ended up at the small cemetery near the old church, the one Brandon used to joke about, saying I'd been left there as a baby. I turned on the car light, popped the glove compartment. There was a box, one I'd never noticed before. Maybe Mom had placed it there while I was setting up the party. Inside was a stack of papers, a birth certificate, a handwritten letter, a faded photo of a young woman with curly brown hair and eyes that looked like mine. The birth certificate didn't say Smith under Mother's name. It read Victoria Carter, father unknown. I could barely breathe. I unfolded the letter. The first line, written in fading ink, read, "Alex, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't stay by your side. I couldn't read any further." My vision blurred. My throat locked up. I was right. I didn't belong here. But now, I knew why. I sat there in the car for hours, under the dull glow of a street lamp. Suddenly, every childhood memory, the cold eyes of my father, my mother's trembling hands, Brandon's cruel grin started to make sense. But the biggest question still lingered. Why did they raise me out of love? Guilt? Or something darker? I got home just before dawn. Mom was still up, sitting on the couch, a half-knitted scarf in her lap, eyes swollen from crying. When she saw me, she stood, but I raised my hand to stop her. I went upstairs, locked my door. I didn't sleep that night. I wrote down every word Brandon had said, every rejection from my father, every strange look from my mother. And I finally understood I didn't need to belong to this family to matter. But I did need the truth, and I had to know what had they been hiding from me for the past 18 years after that birthday party. I thought the secrets would start unraveling. I had the birth certificate, a letter I still hadn't read past the second line. A real name, my birth mother's Victoria Carter. But the thing that kept me up at night wasn't pain. It was suspicion. Like I'd only scratched the surface of something much older, deeper, and far scarier than just being adopted. I hid everything, the letter, the documents, the photo in a locked drawer in my desk. Not because I was afraid someone might take them, but because I wasn't ready. Not yet. Not to face all of it. A week later, after a spring storm had just swept through Georgia, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of wind howling past my window and something slamming downstairs. I crept out of bed, left the lights off. Downstairs, the library lamp was still on. I pressed my ear against the door. Inside, my mom's voice rang out tight and trembling. I can't do this anymore. Robert? Alex knows. He found Victoria's birth certificate. What? How the hell did he get that? I put it in his birthday gift box. I thought, if not now, then maybe never. I stopped breathing. My heart pounded so violently. I thought I might pass out. We made a promise. Susan. You and I both agreed he would never know who he really was. What good was that promise? So he could spend his life being hated under this roof. So Brandon could humiliate him every year and I'd just watch. I heard a chair screech across the floor. Then my dad slamming his hand on the desk. You think I didn't see it? I did. But you don't understand, Victoria wasn't just your sister. She made a mistake. And that boy is the result. My body went rigid. Victoria was Mom's sister. That meant I was her nephew, her blood. Then why had no one ever told me what was my mother, my real mother in this family's eyes? And why did I have to bear the weight of it? Alex has the right to know the truth, Mom said, her voice cracking. He deserves to know who he is. I didn't hear Dad respond, just a long, heavy sigh, like he was carrying a lifetime of shame on his back. He doesn't need to know who his real father was. For a second, I almost kicked that door open, but I didn't. I turned and ran upstairs, chest pounding, throat tight, cold sweat tracing down my spine. I was the result of something wrong. I was brought into this house for what redemption cover-up? I sat at my desk. Opened the letter again, and the next line hit me like a blade. I never wanted to leave you, Alex. But I did something our family couldn't forgive. They said I had to disappear, and they kept you to fix my mistake. I dropped the letter. It felt like the ground had vanished beneath me. I hadn't been adopted out of love. I'd been kept like a debt that had to be paid. For 18 years, I thought I'd been the unwanted one. But maybe they needed me more than I ever needed them. 2 years after the night I eavesdropped on that argument, my father, Robert Smith, died suddenly of a heart attack. The news spread like wildfire through Atlanta's business world. The press hailed him as the man who turned Smith Tech into a billion-dollar empire. And me, I stood behind the doors of the funeral service, quietly watching people pay tribute. Most of them had no idea who I even was. I didn't cry, not a single tear. Not because I hated him, but because my heart had long stopped registering pain. I didn't know what he really was to me, an adoptive father, a silent punisher, or a man carrying a secret so heavy it killed the kindness in him. After the funeral, his longtime attorney, Gerald Warren, a balding, cautious man, summoned the family and Smith Tech's key shareholders to his downtown Atlanta office. The conference room was softly lit, with windows overlooking the city skyline. The scent of old oak and expensive cologne thickened the tension. I sat in the far corner, at the end of the table. Brandon sat at the head, legs crossed, tapping his fingers like he was about to debut his new reign. Gerald began reading the will. The early provisions were unsurprising: a portion to charity, a trust for my mother. The rest, everyone assumed, would go to Brandon. But then Gerald paused, adjusted his glasses, and pulled out a second envelope, thicker, sealed with aged wax. He said, "Before we proceed, I've been instructed to open a supplementary clause, only to be revealed upon Mr. Robert Smith's death." Brandon raised an eyebrow. Mom clenched her hands. My heartbeat thundered. Gerald opened the envelope, removed a typed document, and began to read, "I, Robert C. Smith, being of sound mind, hereby declare the following: if, at the time of my passing, the boy known as Alex James Carter, also referred to as Alex Smith, is still alive and willing, then all controlling shares of Smith Tech, my investment accounts, and personal properties shall be transferred to him." The room went silent, like all the air had been sucked out. Brandon shot up. "What the hell? He's not your real son." Gerald raised a hand, calm and firm. Under Georgia law, a legally adopted child is entitled to inherit, provided they're named explicitly in the will and per guardianship records. Alex James Carter was legally re-registered as Robert Smith's son in 2007. My mother covered her mouth in shock. Brandon turned to me, eyes burning. "You knew this, didn't you?" I said nothing, because my mind was still spinning from something else. Alex James Carter. That was the name on my original birth certificate. And now, it was in the will. So he knew. He knew I wasn't his biological son. He knew I was Victoria's child. He knew everything. Then why give me everything? Gerald kept reading. "However, the assets and executive rights will only be granted if Alex agrees to appear under his real name, A.J. Carter, and proves his capability by taking on a senior executive role at Smith Tech within 6 months." Brandon let out a dry laugh. "He's a loser. What the hell does he know about running a company?" Still, I said nothing. But this time, it wasn't fear that kept me quiet. It was clarity. My adoptive father never loved me, but he knew I was smart enough to become what he never could be, and this was his way of making it right. I stood and walked toward the center of the room. My eyes swept over everyone's shareholders, partners, my mother, Brandon, and landed on the will. I said only one thing: I accept. Brandon stormed toward me, seething. "You're not getting near that chair, you fraud." I smiled. Calmly. "Relax. I won't sit in that chair, not until I earn it. But you, what exactly do you think you've earned?" He didn't respond, but his eyes did. For the first time in my life, I saw something new in Brandon's face. Not arrogance, not disgust, fear, and this was only the beginning. From the moment I accepted the terms of the will, Alex Smith vanished from Atlanta's social radar. No one heard from him again. But behind closed doors at Smith Tech, a new figure had quietly appeared: A.J. Carter, listed in internal memos as Special Executive Advisor for Internal Restructuring. A title vague enough to conceal who I really was, but powerful enough to grant me access to every strategic room that mattered. I didn't walk in like some spoiled heir waving a claim. I entered like an outsider, more accurately, like a system auditor brought in to find where the rot lived. I cut my hair short, shaved clean, switched to steel-rimmed glasses. No flashy suits like Brandon's Ralph Lauren ensembles or those gaudy gold watches. Just a pale blue shirt, charcoal tie, plain leather shoes. But my eyes, they were different. Cold. Focused. and they remembered everything he ever said about me. I had an ally, Mr. Thomas Grady, former senior executive VP under my father, and the one man Robert Smith trusted completely. He had helped build Smith Tech from the ground up, and he was the first to approach me after the will was read. Robert had his flaws. Grady told me on our first private meeting, but he never doubted your intelligence. He once said to me, "That kid will go farther than Brandon. He knows the value of silence and exactly when to break it." So we made a plan quietly. Brandon, assuming I was just some hired consultant brought in by the shareholders to check him, didn't think twice. To him, I was a temporary inconvenience. He didn't know that every word he said, every signature he made, I was watching, recording, analyzing. I started with something simple, a company-wide audit of the supply chain. Brandon threw a fit, calling it a complete waste of funds. But the shareholders backed me. When the audit came in, it showed over $2 million siphoned off through shady shipping contracts, all signed by Brandon. He started to sweat. Then I laid the next trap, a new hot investment pitch from a rising biotech firm. I pretended to be intrigued. Just enough for Brandon to overhear during an after-hours bar meeting. Just like I planned, he bypassed the board and signed a test deal with the firm himself. 3 weeks later, that biotech startup was under SEC investigation for securities fraud. And Brandon. He found himself on the hot seat during an emergency shareholder meeting. I sat there, silent, until one of the largest shareholders stood and asked, "Who authorized this deal?" All eyes turned to Brandon. He pointed at me. "Him, he's the advisor." I replied with one line, "I can provide all meeting notes, emails, and call logs proving I was never consulted about this investment. Brandon, if you have evidence to the contrary, by all means, present it." He couldn't. He'd gotten too arrogant to cover his tracks. That meeting changed everything. The whispers began. Some called me Robert's man. Others didn't even whisper, "If he's Carter, maybe he should be running this place." I didn't confirm, but I didn't deny it either. I wanted Brandon to crumble under the weight of his own fear 1 inch at a time. That night, he stormed into my office for the first time since I returned to Smith Tech. "What do you want?" he growled. "I know who you are. You think you fooled me. You bastard," I didn't answer. I just opened my desk drawer and placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside, a photo of my mother, Victoria Carter, holding me as a baby, and a copy of a letter my adoptive father had written to his attorney. "If the boy accepts his real name, give him every opportunity I never gave him in life." Brandon stared, staggered like he'd just been punched in the face. I said, "I never had to fool you, Brandon. I just had to let you reveal yourself. And you've done that beautifully." His face didn't hold contempt anymore. Not smugness. Just panic. And that's when I knew Smith Tech was no longer his domain. It had already begun becoming mine. Still, I didn't make a grand announcement, because I knew my greatest weapon wasn't the truth. It was silence, and the right moment. And that moment was coming. A month after Brandon humiliated himself in my office, Mr. Grady walked in with a look I'd never seen before. Firm, quiet, unshakable. "It's time," he said, placing the official schedule for Smith Tech's annual shareholder meeting in front of me. Friday, 9 a.m., Thought second floor conference room. Every major shareholder, executive, strategic partner, and financial journalist would be there. This wasn't going to be a shadow game anymore. That night, I sat alone in my office, staring at a photo of my mother, Victoria Carter, next to a copy of the will. I thought about the fear in Susan's eyes, about the words my adoptive father had left behind. Give that boy the chances I never gave him. tomorrow. I wouldn't just claim my inheritance. I would liberate the name A.J. Carter from the shadows of shame. That morning, Brandon strutted into the boardroom like he'd just inked a billion-dollar deal. Navy pinstripe suit, Rolex gleaming, that smug, rehearsed smile. He greeted shareholders like a crowned CEO, without so much as glancing my way. He didn't know I'd had the legal department send formal notices to all shareholders requesting their presence for an executive update. And he had no idea that I was about to do what my father never had the courage to do. Once everyone was seated, Mr. Grady stood. We'll begin with the 6-month executive report and a personnel announcement. Brandon stood, but Grady raised a hand. Sorry, Brandon. This announcement isn't yours to make. The energy shifted. Heads turned toward me. I rose, unbuttoned the top of my vest. Calm, expressionless. My name is A.J. Carter, and I am the sole heir to Robert Smith's estate, assets, and executive control of Smith Tech in accordance with the terms outlined in his legal will. A wave of murmurs swept the room like wildfire. One older shareholder scowled Carter, and I nodded. Victoria Carter was my birth mother, Susan's youngest sister, and Robert Smith, the man you once called a visionary CEO, adopted me under the condition that my identity remain hidden until his death. Brandon shot to his feet, face red and trembling. Lies no one's ever acknowledged that he's not family. I turned to him. Steady. Really? Then how did you know my name? How did you know I was Carter if no one ever said anything? He froze. Silence fell. I turned to Mr. Grady, please. Grady nodded and activated the LED screen behind him. A grainy video played security footage from my father's private study. His voice, worn and rasping, echoed through the room. If Alex, or A.J., accepts his true name, then I believe he'll outperform anyone in this family. Brandon. He's not a bad kid, but he was raised on illusions. Alex lived with the truth from day one. That makes him stronger. Gasps rippled through the room. Brandon stumbled back like someone had punched him in the chest. But I wasn't done. I pulled out a folder and handed it to the lead shareholder. This is the internal investigation report of Brandon's contract violations over the past 3 years. Evidence of shell companies, bribes to secure deals, and over $6 million in damages to Smith Tech. One board member exploded. Good God. Why didn't we know about this sooner? I answered evenly. Because I needed time to verify it. I didn't want to be like Brandon, rush to conclusions and explain later. Brandon screamed. I'm his biological son. I belong here. The room froze. For the first time, Gerald, my father's longtime attorney, stood. I'm sorry, Brandon. But according to a confidential DNA test conducted in 2010, Robert Smith was not your biological father. A silent explosion shook the room. Brandon collapsed into his seat, mouth open, unable to speak. Susan, my aunt, burst into tears. I looked at her. Some part of me wanted to go to her. But not today. Not here. I said. I didn't come here to fight for power. I came to reclaim what's rightfully mine. And if you'll let me, I'll lead Smith Tech into a future free of the shadows cast by lies. No one spoke. Then slowly, one by one, they began to clap. Soft at first, then louder, until it echoed like a storm. For the first time ever, the name A.J. Carter rang out, not as a whisper or a scandal, but as a declaration. And Brandon, he sat there pale, exposed, stripped bare in front of the very people who once worshipped him. And now, no one even looked his way. 2 weeks after that historic shareholder meeting, the name A. J. Carter lit up every financial news outlet. Robert Smith's secret heir flips the board at Smith Tech. Forbes wrote, Business Insider called me the survivor who walked out of the shadows. But me, I didn't care about the headlines. I only wanted one thing to close the loop of pain. Brandon vanished from the company that same afternoon, but he didn't vanish from my life. 3 days later, he showed up outside my mother's house not to fight, but to cry. I sat in my car down the block, watching him from a distance. The man who once embodied the perfect blueprint of a corporate heir now stood hunched, with patchy stubble and eyes lost like a kid who didn't understand what he'd lost. Mom came to the door. She froze when she saw him. They didn't hug. They didn't weep. They just looked at each other. And then he said, I don't even know who I am anymore. Mom, and for the first time in my life, I saw Brandon without the mask. I didn't walk up to them. Not because I was angry, but because I understood. He was punishing himself in ways no verdict from me ever could. That night, I sent a private email to HR provide Brandon Smith with a career reset support package. Recommend him for a logistics supervisor role at our Portland branch. Living wage, nothing more. I didn't want him to suffer. I wanted him to learn how to live without privilege, without the crutch of a name. He needed to start over, the way I once had. No one patting him on the back. As for my mother, Susan, she didn't speak to me for 3 days after the board meeting. Then one night, she called me over and placed a letter in my hands. This was written by Victoria. She said quietly, Before I took you in, I never had the courage to read it. But you should. I brought the letter home, sat in the soft yellow glow of my apartment, and read every line like it was a stitch closing an old wound. My dearest Alex, if you're reading this, it means I did something you'll never understand. I was wrong to leave you, but I had no choice. I wasn't strong enough to keep you with me, and they promised they'd give you a better future. If Susan reads this letter, please tell my son that I love him. Always. You were never a mistake. You were the only reason I survived my darkest days. And if you can still believe in love, live as someone who carries light, not the shadow I once lived in. I folded the letter, laid a hand over my heart. Something inside me dropped, and I felt weightless. The next morning, I drove to the old orphanage outside Savannah, the place listed on my original birth certificate. The director, Ms. Linda, looked like she'd seen a ghost when I introduced myself. I'm A.J. Carter. I was here. Year 2000. She brought me to her office, flipped through the old records, then pulled out a single crumpled page. A toddler's drawing a woman with long hair, arms wide open, next to it, in shaky handwriting. Did Mommy come back yet? I broke down. The following day, I signed the documents to transfer 3% of my personal Smith Tech shares into a permanent scholarship fund for the orphanage. Named it the Victoria Fund, for the children with no names, no families, but with dreams. I didn't want to erase the past. I wanted to turn it into fuel. And every time I walked into the office as Carter, I reminded myself I represent every kid who was once rejected, labeled a mistake, and still stood up taller than anyone ever expected. And finally, I saw Emily again, the girl who left my 18th birthday party with pity in her eyes. I walked into the bookstore where she worked, wearing a plain shirt, no past, no name tag that said Smith, no need to prove anything. I just said, I'm sorry for not having the courage to stand up for myself that night. Or for you. She looked at me for a long moment, then smiled. I always knew you were different, she said. I just didn't know you'd be the one to write your own ending. So we started again. From a cup of coffee, no last names, no inheritance, no legacy to drag behind us. Just me, A, J, Carter, and a brand new life.